Okay, well, I'm joined by Luca Johnson again, and we're going to be talking about the Second Crusade this time. We did the First and the Third Crusade last time, so it makes sense to do the Second Crusade. And you doing all right today, Luca?
I am doing really, really well. I'm here sort of surrounded by my books and my notes and everything, so I'm ready to go for it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I quite like the Second Crusade. Each of at least the first four Crusades, well, all the Crusades really, but the first four, they've each got their own distinct character, haven't they? I think I love the First Crusade because it's sort of the original. You know, there's something sort of so romantic about it. The Third Crusade, obviously, it's sort of quite an English thing, and you've got the Lionheart and everything. But the Second Crusade, I particularly like, even though it's ultimately a bit of a failure. But I think one of the first things to mention is that there's quite a lot more moving parts in this one than the First and the Third. The First and the Third are really quite straightforwardly an attempt, whether it's successful or not, to retake Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Whereas this isn't that, because this takes place in the late 1140s, and the Crusader kings, the Frankish kings, they already control Jerusalem. So, but as I mentioned, there's a lot more moving parts. There's other theatres of war. So in the most general sense, what are your thoughts and feelings about the Second Crusade?
I think that I'm inclined to agree with you that it's certainly, this is one where, you know, it opens up other avenues and theatres of war, particularly obviously in the Iberian Peninsula and certainly even in Eastern Europe. But I've always thought that the second one is often perceived as just a flat out failure. And I think it could be construed that way if you only focus on what happens in Outremer. But if you actually look at what happens in Portugal and in other frontiers, then it's actually a much more of a mixed bag than that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, definitely. So I think what I want to do is to sort of set it up, why it happened and everything, what kicked it off. And then talk about the other theatres. You mentioned there Iberia and Portugal, and then there's one in sort of central northern Germany, sort of the Wendish Crusade, and then on to sort of the main show, the big show, out in the Levant.
Yes.
So I guess just to set it up then, so one of the things I want to say straight off the bat, sort of, again, obvious when anyone looks at this, is we're now 40 years later after the First Crusade, and, you know, the world has moved on. A lot of the original Crusaders have just died of sort of natural causes. And it's sort of a second generation. Quite a lot of them actually born out there. And they've got just different views, just a different way of looking at the world. You know, quite often it only takes one generation for values and just world views to pretty much completely change. So that's one of the first things to mention, I think.
For sure, yes. Well, obviously, I suppose it's really the end point is with the death of Baldwin II in about 1134, and then once he dies, that's it now. It's out. Those who are alive in the Holy Land, the First Crusade is outside of living memory. It's gone. You know, that's sort of those people who fought to actually claim it. They're not there anymore. This is the struggle of the next generation. You know, your ancestors, your fathers, they fought to get this. Now it's your duty to hold it. If it wouldn't be too much straight off the bat, I actually have quite an interesting quote here from a Fulcher of Châtelet, who from about 1127, if I might be permitted to read it.
Yeah, of course, please do, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, he says, "We who were Occidentals now have been made Orientals. He who was a Roman or a Frank is now Galilean or an inhabitant of Palestine. One who was a citizen of Rheims or of Châtelet now has been made a citizen of Tyre or of Antioch. We have already forgotten the places of our birth. Already they have become unknown to many of us, or at least are unmentioned. Some already possess here homes and servants, which they have received through inheritance. Some have taken wives, not merely of their own people, but Syrians or Armenians, or even Saracens, who have received the grace of baptism. Some have with them father-in-laws or daughter-in-laws or son-in-laws or stepson or stepfather. They are here, too, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. One cultivates vines, another the fields. the one and the other use mutually the speech and the idioms of the different languages. Different languages now made common between become known to both races, and faith unites those whose forefathers were strangers.
Great quote. It says a lot, doesn't it, there?
Mm.
I mean, so quite often these people will still have sort of their ancestral names, like, like Fulk of Anjou or something. But
yes.
they've got no connection to Anjou. Well, not no connection, but yeah, it's a really good quote. Really good quote. And I think one of the things to bear in mind is that the original Crusaders just viewed the world, or the Muslim world, Islam, differently. So they were sort of, in comparison, extremely hard line. There was sort of no question that you would take an infidel wife, or that you would treat with Muslim hordes. Whereas the second generation, they're sort of quite easily, there's no problem with making pacts with various sultans and caliphs and things. And as I say, so as you said, they're sort of intermarrying and all sorts of things. So yeah, I suppose it's inevitable though, isn't it? If you sort of live out there, you were born and raised and lived out there, rather than just being essentially an immigrant.
Yes, and this also goes back to something that you and Carl were mentioning, I think, on one of the Rumble hangouts, about the more traditional definition of the word integration, which you can see it here, that really it is about intermarrying, because you've got, for example, as you say, King Fulk, but you've also got Queen Melisande, who was part Armenian, and a lot of her sisters assumed, sort of high positions within Frankish society as well, just as an anecdote. So you can see there is a concerted effort to bring those realms into the Frankish fold to shore up the defence of the Holy Land against those outside of it who'd wish to take it from Christian hands.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I suppose one of the first things to sort of kick off the events, the history of it, is to mention that a lot of those. You mentioned Baldwin the First, obviously long gone. Baldwin the Second is gone. So the King of Jerusalem by marriage is it's Fulk the Fifth, isn't it? Count of Anjou, yes. King of Jerusalem, and he dies from an accident on a hunting expedition, falls off his horse. And I think it's like a really gruesome death. I think like the saddle falls on his head, crushes his head, and
he dies 3 days later.
Well,
so that's a really prolonged, excruciating way to go.
Yeah. Well, one account I read just recently, this morning, in fact, it said that his brains came out of both ears and both nostrils. So either that's an exaggeration, which I think it may well be, or because you can't live for a few days after that. But either way, the King of Jerusalem dies sort of out of the blue, out of nowhere. And as often happens in the pre-modern world, let alone the bloody 12th century, if a king, certainly sort of a powerful established king, dies for whatever reason, it's sort of a call to arms for all your enemies. It's sort of, you may as well have a shot at rebelling from his sort of over kingship if you can, if you're in a position to. And certainly that's what happens. And this is the 1140s now that happens. And so we get straight into Zengi. We have to mention Zengi, who was sort of the great Atabeg of Mosul. And now this is something I think we have to mention sort of very, very quickly, sort of right near the beginning, is the Muslim world is it's not unified. It's not one thing. They've got loads and loads of different factions, just as the European Christian world has. I think maybe some people who don't really know, might not know much about it, might think that there's sort of a grand caliph in Baghdad or Medina or something, and the entire Muslim world is sort of loyal to them. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. There's loads and loads of different factions. There's still the Seljuk Turks of the Sultanate of Rum in sort of Anatolia, modern day Turkey. In the north of what we call Iraq, there was a guy called Zengi, Iman ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg, the great Atabeg, and he controlled at least indirectly controlled Damascus, but directly Aleppo and Homs and lots of modern-day Syria and northern Iraq. And, when he gets word that King Fulk has died, it's sort of his shot to try and take, at least one of the Crusader kingdoms, the most northern one, probably the weakest one, certainly the weakest one, Edessa. And so, I'll let you get a word in edgeways there.
Oh, no, it's quite all right. Well, I think that's a really important point to make, because you have all of these, again, it's so funny, because when we think of Christianity, we think, oh, Great Schism and, the Reformation, and that was like the first split. Well, with Islam, you've got all sorts of denominations coming out of it that are constantly finding conflict with one another. As you mentioned, you've got the Fatimids, and obviously there's a more Ismaili sort of sect of Islam that the assassins have in their holdouts. And you've got, obviously, Shia and Sunni, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Zengi is Sunni, I think.
That's right, yeah.
So, yes, so you can find within this that, yes, Zengi will eventually bring the war to the Franks, but just as much his enemy is Baghdad. He really loathes Baghdad. Baghdad is the other power that's standing in the way of his hegemony, his empire, his imperial ambitions against the Holy Land. And he, in a similar sort of way that Salah ad-Din will do later on, towards the end of the century, it's not just war with the Franks for the sake of crushing the Christians. It's also war with the Franks to endear himself and to create victories that will draw other Muslims away from Baghdad and towards his side of the conflict. So it's as much about empowering himself against the other Muslim rivals in the area as it is direct war with the Christian nations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're enemies with each other completely. One thing I read recently, which I thought was a very interesting point, was how little it seemed by this point still the Christian world and the Islamic world, how little they really understood each other, that both sides hadn't really made it any really concerted sort of academic effort to understand each other's religion and worldview. Most Christians, most Franks that came from Europe to the Levant didn't really know anything about Islam, and the Muslims, I read somewhere, I thought it was a really good line, said that they considered most or all European Christians to be polytheists, essentially. To the Muslim mind, because of course they're very, very monotheistic, aren't they? There's one God, one prophet. And it's as simple as that. Whereas to them, certainly Catholic, 12th century Catholic, with the veneration of Our Lady and various saints and a pope and all sorts of things going on, you're basically a polytheist. I thought that was quite an interesting view.
I've not heard that before. That's very interesting.
Yeah, right. I mean, because Christians don't consider themselves at all. There's one God, there's God Almighty, but there you go. It wasn't until later centuries that scholars on both sides sort of made a concerted effort to sort of try and understand. But yeah, just before we go on about Edessa, just one last time to sort of underscore this view that the world has very much moved on. The Crusader states, you've got Edessa in the north. I'll put a map up so everyone can see. Edessa in the north, the most northerly one. Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. And that these states don't really work together very much. You might think it would just sort of be a no-brainer, or sort of by default they would band together mostly, but they don't. They also fight amongst themselves when they feel they have to, when they think there's something to be gained. Again, in the decades between the First and the Second Crusade, people like Bohemond would still go around, or Raymond of Toulouse, who come into this, go around sort of trying to take advantage of the other Crusader states. When their back's really against the wall, they will sort of kind of obviously work together. But, not always. Definitely not as a matter of course.
I just have one more quote before we sort of close out this view of and move on to, as you say, the fall of Edessa and Zengi. I have this book which I referred to last time, the Travels of Ibn Jubayr, but there's a fantastic bit of sociology in here, and I think it's very interesting, particularly coming from a Muslim source, that he says this: "We moved from Tibnan, may God destroy it, at daybreak on Monday. Our way lay through continuous farms and ordered settlements, whose inhabitants were all Muslims, living comfortably with the Franks. God protect us from such temptation. They surrender half their crop to the Franks at harvest time, and pay as well a poll tax of 1 dinar and 5 quirat for each person. Other than that, they are not interfered with, save for a light tax on the fruits of trees. Their houses and all their effects are left to their full possession, all the coastal cities occupied by the Franks and managed in this fashion, their rural districts, the villages and farms, belonging to the Muslims. But their hearts have been seduced, for they observe how unlike them in ease and comfort are their brethren in the Muslim regions under their Muslim governors. This is one of the misfortunes afflicting the Muslims. The Muslim community bewails the injustice of a landlord of its own faith and applauds the conduct of its opponents and enemy, the Frankish landlord, and is accustomed to justice from him." So a fascinating look into, from a Muslim account, of just, frankly, how good the Muslims have got it under the Franks.
Yeah, that's right. One sort of very, very broad point to make, I think it's interesting that some historians or some people's view of it is that the Christian crusaders, Christian invaders had come and stolen the land, Muslim lands. But of course, they were Christian Roman lands long before the age of Muhammad himself, hundreds of years before that. So, it's not like somewhere like Aleppo is just naturally Islamic. It's just not the case.
No, it's not the case. And as you and Carl have explained on your epochs, this is long ago. This is ancient Mesopotamia. There've been civilizations for here. So this whole purity of the Muslim view of, it was always ours. Well, yes, in living memory, it was yours. But, as we know, these sorts of things aren't immediate. These sorts of feuds can go back centuries and centuries.
Mm-hmm. So in 1144, Zengi realizes that Edessa is a very weak point, a low ebb, and that before many times different Muslim armies have attempted to overrun Edessa and failed, but he sort of sees correctly, sees that this is his time to strike, and does, and is successful in 1144 of taking Edessa, which is, I think it is the biggest just in terms of sheer area of land, but I think it's the least populated and the poorest of the four Crusader states, and it's certainly the most sort of strategically exposed. Again, I'll put a map up so people can sort of see at a glance. It's sort of obviously the most exposed, and so there's the sort of the siege of Edessa. I don't know how much you want to go into that, but the end result of it is that he does take it. And so... Sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I was just going to let you finish. I interrupted.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, it was brutal. It was absolutely brutal because the inhabitants requested that their lives obviously be spared in a very traditional manner that one does when surrendering a siege. And Zengi did... what's the word I'm looking for? He allowed a lot of the Armenians and the Syriacs and a lot of the sort of more indigenous populations inside to live, and obviously sold them into slavery or whatever that may be. But he made an absolute point that no Frank living within those walls was going to leave with their life. Anyone who was Frankish, anyone who come from the West, no, death. And obviously one of his favoured method of execution was crucifixion, of all things. I mean, I know traditions are sometimes important, but, you sort of think, well, the world might have moved on a bit since then. But really, really brutal. I mean, he was in many other ways, from what we were talking about last time with Salah ad-Din, who was a bit more chivalrous, a bit more courteous. He could be reasoned with. Zengi, even amongst his Muslims, was purely a man to be feared and nothing else. He only ruled with fear and terror, not just on his war against the Franks, but against his own people as well. So yeah, not pleasant.
Yeah, ruled with an iron fist, certainly. I think sort of openly described himself as a tyrant and things, and yeah, all his own people absolutely lived in fear of him. Yeah, it's interesting that in the Third Crusade, there's sort of this black mark that nearly always gets mentioned against Richard the Lionheart for massacring the Muslim population of a certain town. But Zengi does it here. And on a larger scale, I believe, although that's not necessarily the point. But yeah, he didn't kill every single Christian, because I believe a large population of sort of Armenian-style, more indigenous type Christians, but all the Franks, men, women and children, were all executed. And so, yeah, if anyone is in a discussion and someone brings up the massacre by Richard the Lionheart, you can just bring up this massacre by Zengi. So yeah, both sides absolutely did it.
Yes.
So yeah, when Edessa falls, I think the biggest point of it is that it seems to strike Europe, Western Europe, as sort of some sort of stunning lightning bolt. They sort of I suppose the fairly low resolution view back in Europe was that everything was sort of okay in the Holy Land. We'd taken Jerusalem in 1099. That's in our hands now. We can go and visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre whenever we want, and Templars and Hospitallers will help you get there if needs be, and the pilgrimage routes are open. So, well, you can certainly go there by sea, and it's all good. But then when they hear that Edessa has fallen, there's some sort of... panic isn't really the right word, because these things play out over a few years, but certainly the Pope and a lot of the church hierarchy are absolutely stunned by this, and they feel, well, the Pope Eugenius III sort of fairly quickly, not immediately, it's interesting to note, but fairly quickly calls for the Second Crusade. There's a papal bull to call the Second Crusade. And there is a bit of politics going on there. That's the one.
Well, I suppose it's that thing as well, isn't it? That because news will just travel so slowly. Because obviously now news is instant. Something bad happens in the world, you know about it instantly, wherever it's happening in the world. But it wouldn't have it probably wouldn't have come from Edessa itself. It's that sort of trail of, well, some of those Armenians would have fled. They'd have had to have walked to the nearest safe haven. That would have taken probably a few days. Then those people will have spoken to those people. Then the ships will have to leave the port, probably some merchants from Genoa, and then they'll travel back to Rome. So, news takes a phenomenally long time to reach the West. There will be a gap of months, possibly weeks at minimum, between what Zengi did at Edessa and the West actually learning about it. But by that time, Zengi's already on the move again. He's already mobilized. So the West has to get itself into gear. It has to call to arms. It has to, so it's an incredibly delayed and slow process.
Yeah, it does take quite a long time for the news to get back to Europe. I mean, I believe it's not until the next year, 1145, when the news at least hits the ears of Eugenius, the Pope. I nearly said in Rome. He's actually not in Rome. He's exiled from Rome at that point. But nonetheless, when the news hits sort of Western Europe, it's the next year, because you just get sort of pilgrims, sort of surviving pilgrims, sort of coming back naturally. And yeah, it's a whole next year. But there's all sorts of politics that's probably not necessarily worth going into here, why the Pope sort of paused before sort of calling a crusade, but he does. And he, at first, in the very, very first instance, it doesn't get a sort of a giant reaction. Eventually it does, but in the first instance, he does have to reissue the bull a few months later because the first one didn't really go down all that well. But I suppose the two main sort of Frankish European kings are Conrad III, the Holy Roman Emperor, a German essentially, and Louis VII of France. Well, again, it's not sort of strictly France, is it yet? I suppose it is. He's a Frankish king, and so they're the two big players that decide to take the cross, and they're both convinced, really, by the figure of Bernard of Clairvaux, or Bernard de Clairvaux, depending on how French you want to get about it. And so he's a massive figure, isn't he, for the 12th century?
In many ways, he is a titan of the age. He is the authoritative voice, in a way, second only to the Pope. So famous was his oratory, so wonderful was his alleged skill as a statesman and as a diplomat, that the Pope, obviously, Eugenius, authorized that he speak on Eugenius's behalf to rally the forces of Christendom for this crusade. No, he was in every way sort of a singular figure of the time, in a way that we can't really imagine nowadays. There's no figure really like it in modern, that has that level of sort of theological authority over spiritual matters. I don't think if there was a Bernard today, they could quite, and I don't mean he couldn't convince a load of people to potter over to the Holy Land and have a war over there. I just mean he couldn't galvanize people's wills on the spiritual level quite like what existed 800 years ago.
Yeah, accounts say that when Bernard of Clairvaux spoke, when he delivered a sermon or when he preached, that many people were absolutely spellbound by it. I think Louis VII, who was very, very pious, sort of famously very pious, sort of treated him as an oracle, sort of some sort of living saint. Sort of everything that came out of his mouth was almost holy, immediately. Again, but sort of by default. Certainly, when he gave big set pieces of oratory, most people seem to all have agreed that it couldn't be more convincing. And yeah, I think you're quite right to put as much emphasis on it as you just did. Say there's no equivalent now. People are more. People just have their own minds a little bit more now. They're sort of a little bit more difficult to convince en masse about things. You'll always have some dissenter, some smart aleck who doesn't agree. Back then, it seemed that Bernard of Clairvaux, everyone agreed with it. I mean, even in centuries since, even Protestants, someone like John Calvin, for example, sort of an ultra-Protestant in a way, still really venerated nearly everything that Bernard of Clairvaux wrote and said. There was one pope that came in who was not all that steeped in theology, and Bernard wrote a treatise, a book about sort of how to be a Christian, how to live the Christian life, and sort of taught a pope, in a way, how to be. He was the head of the Cistercian order, and they're sort of ultra-Catholic in a way, the Cistercians. They were sort of mendicants, in sort of the pre-Francis of Assisi days, but Francis of Assisi-like, in the sense of, living like aesthetes, living not covered in jewels and gold, and wearing, the idea of living in poverty deliberately, to bring you closer to God, and to live your life very much as Christ and the apostles did, or whatever the Bible says they did, to try and really copy that. I think in a way it was a reaction to maybe Clooney, the sort of the Clooney-ac movement. But anyway, Bernard of Clairvaux and the Cistercians at this point had great sway, like unbelievable sway. It's difficult to describe, it seems, how much sway. And as you said, exactly, Eugenius sort of gives him, Bernard of Clairvaux, the green light to go round preaching the crusade. And at that point, it's extremely successful. So I'll mention a Vassile, Louis VII at Vassile, sort of organises Bernard of Clairvaux to speak, where he himself, Louis, sort of formally takes the cross, and a lot of his knights, a lot of his retainers do so. And it was so successful, apparently, that, everyone that was there was completely and utterly bowled over by it, and there weren't enough cloth crosses to give out to everyone that wanted to go, and even Eleanor of Aquitaine herself makes an appearance and pledges that she'll go, and it's just a great scene, Bernard of Clairvaux at Vassili.
Yeah, it makes you want to have been there. It makes you want to have, to have witnessed it for yourself. And I think it's really important the way that he frames the time and the way that he conceptualizes the fall of Edessa, in that it's not some sort of, he basically, for want of a better way to put it, lays it out as this is a reward from God, because God is giving you a chance to do what your fathers did. God is giving, through his divine wisdom that only he could have conceived of, he is giving to you an opportunity to find remission and recompense for your sins in the same way that those who came before you, were absolved of theirs. So all of the previous rhetoric of what it meant to go on crusade, what it spiritually meant for the soul, it sounds cliche, but this is actually history repeating itself. This is very actually copy and paste rhetoric that is being used to galvanize people here. And it works to incredible effect.
Yeah, there are I suppose it's maybe a little bit obvious for crusade buffs to make a connection between Pope Urban II, when he sort of called the First Crusade, and when Bernard of Clairvaux, who obviously isn't a pope, but still, when he sort of preaches for the Second Crusade, there's sort of parallels there that you sort of can't help but see the parallel, if you know about them both. And because Urban II was, apparently very, very persuasive in person, if you heard him speak. And then there's also the parallel that your reward, if you do take the cross, if you do go on crusade, the reward is the same as in the First Crusade, i.e. sort of all your worldly sins will be forgiven when you get to the pearly gates, and St. Peter and or Christ and or God judges you, weighs your soul in the balance against what you did on earth. If you went on crusade, you're sort of guaranteed to get in to heaven. Because
I'd take it.
It's sort of, or at least at the pearly gates, they're asked, why didn't you? We, like the world, reality, gave you an opportunity to go on crusade, and you didn't. Now explain yourself. Why on earth did you not do that? So yeah, there's quite a lot at stake. A great deal at stake, or that's the way it's sort of sold by Bernard of Clairvaux and others. He wasn't the only one, but he did go around Europe, around France, and certainly bits of Germany. Sort of travelled around. Because it was also Bernard of Clairvaux. Sorry?
Wrote letters to England that we still have.
Well, there was a big contingent that left from Dartmouth, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. But also it's important to note that during this time, England is actually going through the anarchy. It's going through a civil war between Empress Matilda and King Stephen. So that's an even... And Bernard makes a very clear point that they are wasting their time and they're dying, killing one another in a pointless, sinful war. And he says, why not dedicate your efforts to a war that is without sin, that is entirely righteous and just, and will actually alleviate the sin from your soul? And so he makes that plea to them. And yes, as you say, many sail from Dartmouth.
And Bernard also goes to sort of Germany, speaks directly to Conrad, and one account I heard that Conrad was moved to tears, quite literally moved to tears. But there's also perhaps a bit more realistic, or sort of the realpolitik of it, that he said, Louis has already signed up for this. Are you going to let him have all the glory? You're not going to let him have all the glory, are you? So there may be that element to it as well. But certainly, they're quite easily the two biggest players. The Third Crusade is sort of usually called the King's Crusade, because you've got the King of England and France going. But this is also a King's Crusade. Conrad is a king, or Holy Roman Emperor even. Louis VII is certainly a king. So this is sort of an earlier King's Crusade. They're big players. It's not like the First Crusade where they're sort of merely counts and dukes and things. We have got actual kings going on this. But as I said earlier, if we could leave Conrad and Louis for a moment, and change scene to some of the sort of secondary theatres, well, they're not really secondary, but just some of the other theatres in this crusade. So there's two. There's one in Germany itself, but there's one in Spain we talked about, didn't we? And so there's the whole thing of the Reconquista going on. Lots of Spain and modern Portugal are still held by Moorish forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the Muslims living there at that time don't seem to have any problem with not being in their ancestral lands. They were more than happy to live in clearly conquered territories. But yes, it's as you say, and obviously you mentioned Spain and Portugal, but this is also what we have to remember, that there isn't really a Spain as per se. There are counties, the county of Portugal. And obviously you have Castile and all of the other places, but a united Spain won't exist yet, of course, until the 1400s, when the last of the Muslims are obviously cast off into the sea and obviously fought back across to Sub-Sahara and the Northern African Peninsula.
No, absolutely, yeah, there's no such thing as Spain or Portugal as we know it whatsoever. In fact, at the high watermark of sort of the Moorish invasions of Spain, well, in the age of Charlemagne, they get up into France even, don't they?
Battle of Tours.
Yeah, sort of into the middle of France, more or less, isn't it? And Charles Martel, and they have to push them back. But at this point, in the sort of mid-12th century, there's Astoria, in sort of very, very northern, well, the most northern bit of Spain, really, across the northern bit of Spain, sort of has held out and is completely independent of Muslim rule. But we've got a couple of figures. There's Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile. And if you look at a map where Leon and Castile is, it's much more sort of central, still northern really, but sort of central Spain. And there's another figure, Afonso of Portugal. He becomes... sort of creates himself a king. It's a county at first. This in a slightly early, one generation before this, it's just the county of Portugal. And anyway, part of the very, very long and protracted story of the Reconquista in this period is that they're able to push down the forces, the anti-Islamic forces, are able to push down to Lisbon, which is right at the bottom of the Iberian Peninsula, the very, very bottom of Portugal. And there had been an unsuccessful siege of Lisbon a few years before this, I believe. But while this is going on, lots of people in Europe are like, okay, it's all very well, it's all terrible, of course, that Edessa has fallen to sort of the rulers of Mosul. But we've got problems in our own lands. If you're from Spain or northern Spain, you're like, well, there's Muslim hordes here. I'm not going to go 6,000 miles away to fight in the Holy Land when, like, literally my home here is in danger of being razed by Muslims. So the Pope is sort of convinced. Has his mind turned to sort of formally include the Iberian Peninsula in this papal bull to call a crusade, and so lots of people get involved in it. Like I say, there's a big contingent from France and from England. We mentioned a big contingent sets out from Dartmouth, but French contingents that are going round by sea. They come down, obviously, sort of the west coast of Spain, or where Portugal is, and are sort of co-opted in to fighting with Afonso against the Moorish hordes at Lisbon. And not just Lisbon, there's also sort of a siege of Tortosa, and they fight at Sintra. They fight a few different places, actually, but I suppose the big goal, the main one, is Lisbon. They land at Oporto, to begin with. I think, am I right in thinking that a lot of them land in the first instance just because of bad weather? They didn't even necessarily mean to, but then once they do land, they're sort of co-opted into this theatre of the Crusade.
That's entirely right. And I also think that something that's very much worth pointing out in terms of the Iberian arena of war is actually how instrumental the Templars were in this particular war as well. What we don't often think about is, so one of the things that's really important about the Second Crusade is actually how it sort of reimagines the Templar order from being just what it originally was conceptualized as a bodyguard, a system of bodyguarding and safeguarding pilgrims to the Holy Land. And now you actually see it almost being reimagined into an actual militaristic order. And one of the things that was really important about this was that when King Alfonso I of Spain died childless back in 1134, he actually split his kingdom between the Templars and the Hospitallers and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he tried to do this, obviously, to avoid a war with his barons, which would so obviously normally happen on the death of a childless monarch in the feudal era. But obviously that was heavily contested by the barons. But the Templars still walked away from that divorce paper, you could call it, with a tenth of the royal revenue and about 6 castles in Spain. So that's a tremendous amount of actual power and footing. But the Templars were really important in also helping to push that. And you can see here their transformation into something more militaristic. But it's not just that. They were incredibly effective at it. And we'll also obviously broach onto that when we look at what they did in the Outremer section of the war as well.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, the way the Templars morph over time quite quickly, really, into sort of fairly badass military order. So same for the Hospitallers, is it? I mean, they were originally meant to be just a hospital of St. John for pilgrims, and then end up becoming sort of very, very militaristic, very, very heavily armed, powerful, well-trained knights.
Yes.
The Hospitallers themselves.
End up sending quite a few Muslims to the hospital instead.
Yeah. So even today, even in the Peninsular War, Lisbon is by far the biggest, richest city in Portugal. I mean, easily, absolutely easily. So where Afonso wants to sort of retake it, it's sort of the biggest prize. And, could spend quite a long time on this, but I don't want to spend too long on it. But ultimately, it's a success. And out of everything that happens in the 1140s and the different parts of the Second Crusade, I think it's fair to say, I think there's no dispute, that is the biggest success, because that's a giant prize, really. I mean, that sort of turns the tide of the Reconquista in a way. It's a massive loss for the Muslim world. It's a massive gain for the Christian world. It's a massive gain for Iberia, for Spain and Portugal, because it's right there in the south. It's not like, even though it's a massive city that it is, it's not like it's right in the north of Spain. It's right in the south. So, sort of Portugal, rather. And so Afonso sort of becomes king, and I don't believe the Moors ever take it back. So
no, I don't think they do either. No, from what my memory recollects. And it's also that thing as well, isn't it, that when you look at it on the grander scale of just the theatre of Europe as a whole, obviously in pushing the Muslims out of the West, out of Spain, once you've solved that problem, it means that you're able to actually move more troops to the east towards Outremer, because you're not currently worrying about having that war on all those different fronts. And so by doing one, you actually help in the other, theoretically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're not fighting a war on 2 fronts anymore, which is just a giant strategic advantage, isn't it? Just giant. And I suppose just a few quick details about the Siege of Lisbon, because some people are experts just in that. If you wanted to, could do a whole discussion or podcast just on that. So the siege lasts about 4 months, which is to say it's not over super quick, but it's not that long either. Quite often you might stare down the barrel of a multiple years long siege of a big city like Lisbon. So 4 months. They undermine the wall, sort of a classic undermining situation with sappers, what today we'd call sappers, where they dig tunnels underneath a section of the wall and prop it up with wooden props, and then when the time's right, burn the props, and the ground literally collapses under the wall, and that part of the wall collapses, and now there's a breach in the wall, and now you can rush in. Sort of a classic example of that, isn't it? And apparently there's famously from the accounts, one of the sort of the headlines, takeaway things that quite often get mentioned if you hear about the Siege of Lisbon in any real detail. There's a famously a great cry of despair went up from the defenders, that they realised a lot of them, or nearly all of them, were probably going to die today, and it's a giant loss for the entire Islamic world, and so that's sort of the big event in the West.
Yeah, it's very dramatic. And those Anglos and Frenchmen who'd obviously come over from Dartmouth, they end up wintering, I think, in Lisbon, and then sort of sail. A lot of them stay, and then some of them sail out once the wintering period is over down the Mediterranean, and will actually join up with the story later on when we get over to the Holy Land.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. I believe lots of them stayed at that point, because part of the deal Afonso said to them is that if we do get inside in Lisbon, I'll sort of let you pillage it more or less. Because, of course, there's this classic thing when we talk about the Crusades, is that it's extremely spiritual, and it's about reconquering the most holy sites in Christendom, and it's about your immortal soul, and all that is true, absolutely. But it's also about a bit of plunder, trying to get a bit of money and silver and gold things and gems if you can. It is an opportunity for that as well. So if you were one of those people that really cared more about that, or primarily about that, and you only have to go as far as southern Spain to fulfil those goals, it's like, well, I'm not going to go on to the Holy Land and probably get chopped to pieces in the Anatolian hinterlands by some Seljuks. No, I've found a nice bit of land here, maybe met a beautiful Spanish wife, and I've got gold and things now. No, I'm done. I'll stay here. I'm perfectly happy with that.
And it's one of those things, isn't it, that one of the things to point out is that back during the First Crusade, about 3/4 of the people who set out from that died trying to reach the Holy Land. Those, I don't want to understate it, but they're not great odds, are they? There's quite a... so they definitely made quite a sensible decision, I think, staying in Portugal.
Yeah, it's one of the sort of perennial points to make about all the Crusades, is that a relatively small fraction end up getting to the destination, if at all. You're sort of quite likely to be lost along the way, one way or the other, either lose your bottle or give up and turn back, or killed along the way, or many adventures on the way, which could stop you from getting there. Lots of them end up staying in Spain and Portugal, but not all of them do, and some of them also carry on and do end up actually in the Holy Land fighting. We see eventually. So if we could leave Iberia there for the moment, and that the Siege of Portugal is 1147, I believe. So already we see a few years have ticked by. So we're going to go back in time now, but if you see that Zengi took Edessa in 1144, the Pope calls it in 1145, and Lisbon falls in 1147, you can see some years have ticked by there. So if we go back in time a bit, and I want to briefly talk about the Wendish Crusade, which most people, unless you sort of know the Second Crusade in any real detail, you probably could be absolutely forgiven for not really having heard of it, or not really knowing any detail about it. But the land of the Wends is in sort of central northern Germany. It's sort of around where the rivers Elbe and Oder are. I mean, it's sort of east of Saxony and west of sort of modern Poland, sort of north of Bohemia. I'll put a map up, just below the sort of Denmark. It's there, sort of central northern Germany. And there'd been, over a few generations, quite a lot of Slavic people had sort of gone there, lived there, set themselves up there. And a lot of the Christians, people that were loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor and to Rome, or to the Pope, whether he be in Rome or not, decided that something really ought to be done about this. And again, the southern Germans, a little bit more, and this is a sort of a fairly vague trend. The southern Germans are more likely to just go on crusade to the Holy Land. The northern ones are like, well, we've got sort of enemies here. We've got religious, spiritual enemies right here. And so, again, the Pope is sort of formally coerced, or just changes his mind that he allows an element of the crusade to take on the Wends. And so that happens. That's a whole episode.
Oh yeah, no, it's entirely a whole episode, but it's quite an important turning point, I suppose, as well, because now all of a sudden crusade isn't just something that you do against the Muslims; it's just against all who lie outside of Christendom. You know, it's which is actually not an inconsequential thing. And as you mentioned, those sort of lands, those are incredibly lucrative lands. Those are very fertile lands, very rich, and they're obviously. But I think that the Wendish Crusade certainly speaks more to that aspect of the Crusade, which is grounded in resources and plunder, and the more sort of temporal aspect of what it means to go out and be at war, as opposed to the spiritual aspect. When I look at and contrast the three arenas of war, I think that one is the most transparently about just natural resource gathering and conquering. There doesn't seem to be, I mean, don't get me wrong, they had obviously been harassed by the Wendish people. There has to be some room for antagonization to create any sort of. The Pope wasn't just going to say, "Oh yeah, and those guys, you know, east of the border, might as well just get them too." There is obviously more to it than that.
Up there, they have an imperial diet. You know, a big meeting where they decide up and around Frankfurt. They decide that something really needs to be done about the Wends. And so sort of some Danes, Saxons, Poles, quite a big coalition, I suppose you could say, all decide that they're sort of going to gang up on the Wends. And a papal legate is put in charge of it, Anselm of Havelberg. So, you know, it's formally green-lit by the papacy. But yeah, you're quite right. You know, I think all academics and historians agree that this one is sort of fairly transparently a bit different now. Yeah, it's not just purely about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's not just purely about sort of the lands where, you know, like there's the Sea of Galilee and the Holy Land. It's not really anything to do with that now. It's just anyone who isn't, well, Catholic, basically. And yeah, there's a lot of, it's much more about, there are just sort of aliens in your lands that you're sort of religiously, spiritually, politically at odds with. And the Pope has sort of said that not only won't you be damned forever for murder, you'll be rewarded eternally for it. So again, it's sort of, it's a bit of a sea change, I think, absolutely. Absolutely, it's fair to say that. And so go ahead.
And it's also, I think, interesting to note that with the Second Crusade and that Wendish sort of arena of war, what's interesting to point out is sort of when I'd said, you know, sort of anyone who's sort of outside of Christendom. What's interesting to point out, though, to sort of bolster the other side of the argument, is actually the way that the elites within Christendom, the Pope and the Bernard de Clairvaux, and all of these people, how they actually treat the pogroms that are happening at this time, which is a little bit different to the first, because Bernard makes a point in that letter to England and in several other letters that he sends throughout Christendom, that no, that the punishment that the Jews written, you know, to suffer for their crimes is that they are scattered. that's a punishment from God. They're not supposed to be destroyed. They're supposed to be scattered. And we need them we need to leave them alone because they are here to bear witness to our redemption. So they are our witnesses from the outside that we are doing God's work. And so I just thought that was a very interesting window from sort of the time period that we're looking at. It's to bring that from the highest sphere of society. I just thought it was a very interesting perspective.
Again, there are some pogroms that go on at this stage under some specific leaders, which is just interesting to note. One episode from the Wendish Crusade I think's quite interesting is at one point, sort of a Christian sort of Frankish host turns up outside Stettin, the city of Stettin, looking to sort of sack it, looking to sort of besiege it and sack it, only to discover that they're completely Christian. And their bishop or archbishop or something, or prince bishop or something, comes out and says, like, what do you think you're doing? We're Christian. And the Frankish army does, to be fair to them, say, oh, all right, fair enough, sorry, and turn around, essentially. But the point is that this element comes up in the Wendish Crusade a fair bit, where the leaders find themselves sacking and murdering and pillaging other Christians. And even at the time, literally at the time, they're like, wait, what are we doing? Like, wasn't there originally something to do with Odessa? Why are we now killing ourselves and burning our own lands? Right, so quite quickly it sort of goes off the rails up there.
They just need to wait till the Fourth Crusade happens.
Well, right. Yeah, absolutely. We've got to do another one, Luca, on the Fourth Crusade. That's got to happen. But yeah, whenever I mention Stettin, whenever I hear Stettin, I always hear, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. He mentions Stettin. Yes. From Stettin in the Baltic. It's even posher now. Stettin in the Baltic. I always think that it's such a long way from Edessa and Jerusalem, and it's sort of, there's a little bit of, maybe I'm exaggerating it a bit, but a little bit of insanity has seeped in by this point, when they're burning down villages and things up in the Baltic, essentially, because Zengi took Edessa. It's like, well, it's interesting also to mention, another element of it is that how interconnected the world is, or at least Europe and the Near East, that the events in modern-day Syria directly affect things that happen in northern Germany. I mean, very, very directly. It's just interesting to note that the world isn't as perhaps isolated as people might think in the 12th century.
Yes, for sure. And I think as well that it's one of those things, isn't it, that with the Wendish Crusade, you'll be more of an authority on me than this, but it doesn't really happen again, does it? This sort of thing throughout the rest of the Crusades. This is a bit of a blip. I know that when the Teutonic Knights are sort of formed around a little bit later, they end up having a war there as well. But I think that's more around 1300, which is after the Crusades are sort of ostensibly over. But is there any repetition of this throughout the later Crusades, to your memory?
Not on this scale, as far as I know. Not on this scale, because even though we're mentioning this as a bit of a side theatre, if you lived through it, there'd be nothing periphery about it. I mean, one of the big players up there is Henry the Lion. That was his name, Henry the Lion. And it seems like his men went around burning and raping and pillaging on quite a substantial scale. So, yeah, not that I'm aware in any of the later Crusades was anything in that part of Europe on that scale. But the other thing it does speak of is that it's not just like a pure insanity. Like, it's not like the people of Pomerania and Saxony just suddenly went mad, like the pogroms, the same thing. It's not like people just suddenly, the Pope's allowed us to start killing anyone we want, so we're going to. No, The reality would have been that there would have been almost certainly generations-long levels of really, really bitter resentment and hatred between different peoples. And that this is just the final expression of that pressure. You know, because sometimes it gets something like the Wendish Crusade or the various pogroms in the Crusades. Some historians want to describe it as just like a type of a mania that's come out of nowhere. It's just the Europeans are just bloodthirsty and just murderous by nature, and that's it. That's the explanation for it. Well, no, they're like all peoples everywhere. They're actually usually quite reasonable. Even, you know, in the 12th century, where you think, oh, it's a lot more brutal, life's a lot cheaper back then, which is true, I think. But nonetheless, you don't get something like the Wendish Crusade or pogroms just happen out of nowhere for no reason. But there you go.
It's just not how life. It's not how life works, is it?
Yeah. That's not what reality is like.
Everything has a cause, and sometimes those causes, as you say, can be very, very old, and sometimes even ancient.
Absolutely. Well, let's get on to then the big show, the main event. Conrad and Louis going down to Constantinople, then through Turkey and down to the Crusader states, Outramar. So, one of the first things to mention is that Conrad gets there first, even though Louis had sort of taken the cross first. Quick side note, someone said that he was considering doing a massive armed pilgrimage even before the fall of Edessa and the news got back to the Pope and the Pope calling the Crusade, that Louis had really wanted to do that anyway. And then suddenly all this happens and it's just sort of perfect from his point of view. And of course, he's not going to fail to take the cross. However, it still takes quite a while to get your army together. And some say he had, something like 15, 17 or 1,000 men. But Conrad III gets together, it's well over 25 different contingents of knights. And he musters something like 20,000 men. And, there's two ways you can get to, sort of Antioch or Jerusalem, wherever your final destination is, somewhere on the extreme eastern Mediterranean. You can either go by sea or you can go across land. And to begin with, both Louis and Conrad deliberately wanted to go across land because they wanted to emulate the First Crusade. People like Bohemond and Tancred and Geoffrey de Bouillon, they're like heroes now. I know it's only like 45 years later, but they're sort of passed into legend, absolutely, already. And if you can recreate anything they did, that's just brilliant, that in the mind of someone like Conrad or Louis. And so that's what they do. Sure. Conrad wants to go to Constantinople and then hack his way through Anatolia.
And you can see the allure of it. One thing that interesting that you were mentioning about the fact that people sort of became legends so quickly. I think one point to mention is that after Bernard Clairvo dies, he's made a saint 20 years later. You know, that's an incredibly quick, amount of time, especially when you consider it took Joan of Arc about 500 years to get made a saint, or even Thomas More. It took him hundreds of years to get made a saint. 20 years, that's phenomenally quick. But yeah, you can certainly see the allure of wanting to do. Again, it's the reasons. It's remission of sins. It's to uphold the weight of what your fathers did before you. You can understand the pull of wanting to do things almost by the book now. Well, this worked last time, and we're here now. And it by all accounts, you would think on paper that this would actually be easier than the First Crusade, because the first one had to start from scratch. But what you have here is you actually already have a settled presence in Outramar. And just because Edessa has fallen, as you say, you still have Antioch and Jerusalem and Tripoli. So you already have a base of operations that's set up. And so, yeah, on paper, you can see how sure that there wouldn't really be a lot of room to doubt in many ways that this was all going to go horribly wrong, in my mind.
Yeah, and Bernard of Clairvaux sells it like it's a foregone conclusion. Like, God is on your side, so that's it. You're definitely going to win. There's no doubt. in my mind, Bernard of Clairvaux. No doubt in my mind, you're definitely going to win. You just need to go there, recreate what you're going to have more men than the First Crusade. You've already got this great base of operations. We're not even asking you to get all the way to Jerusalem. Now, that's a key point. The goal here is to retake Edessa, not Jerusalem. So your ultimate aim is easier. The whole thing is you're definitely going to win. So, without too many spoilers, where the crusade in Portugal and Spain was basically a full success, the crusade in Germany was sort of an abject failure. We should have finished up on that actually quickly, just to say is that nothing really is gained in the Wendish Crusade, particularly. It sort of peters out. It effectively sort of peters out, doesn't it? There's no sort of massive gain, and all the Slavic people, all the Wends are either expelled from Germany or killed. Nothing like that happens. So, whereas this part of it is somewhere in between. But we'll get onto it. So Conrad goes down to Constantinople first, and there's obviously a Byzantine emperor in Istanbul, or Constantinople, it's Manuel, isn't it? Manuel Komnenos, Manuel the First. And so there's always an interesting relationship between sort of Catholic, Western European Christians and the Greeks, the so-called Greeks, or the Byzantines, or the Eastern Christians.
Yeah, no, totally. And to bring it back to a point that you made not long ago about things not just falling out of the sky and that everything, has a cause. Not to skip too far ahead, but I think one of the most, when you invited me to do this with you and do these crusading discussions with you, one of the most interesting things to look back at it all was to look at the First Crusade, look at the Second Crusade and the Third. And then you understand the Fourth in a whole different context, because all of a sudden this doesn't just fall out of the sky, what happens in the Fourth Crusade. There is a breakdown over the past 100 years of the trust between the Franks and the Byzantines. And the second with this as well, I think, was a major catalyst for that.
Absolutely. Without completely ruining, spoiler alert, even though it happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago, what happened in the Fourth Crusade. There's quite a lot of things that happened in history. Whereas if you look at the actual events in isolation, you're like, what? Why? That's mad. How did that ever happen? What could possibly have ever caused? It's just sheer mad, and you just fall back and say, well, it's just sheer madness. Men went mad then. That's the only thing that could possibly explain it. Well, no, if you look at the context and you look at decades or even hundreds of years of previous events, it actually does make some sense. There is at least a logic to it. And that's absolutely, I think, the case with the Fourth Crusade. If you just look at the thing, it's like, well, that's bananas, that's bonkers, what on earth? But yeah, if you actually look at the 100 years or more preceding it, it starts to make some sense. So, just to mention that then on the Fourth Crusade is that the relationship between the Eastern and the Western Christians absolutely falls apart in the Fourth Crusade. But so at this point, Conrad is still effectively, at least nominally, on paper, completely welcomed in Constantinople. And always sort of quite quickly ferried across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible, all his men. And they're actually, Conrad is quite confident as a commander to begin with, and we can look back now with 2020 hindsight and see that he was quite incompetent. He wasn't a great general at all. Someone like Bohemond or even Robert Curthose was actually very competent. Richard III, very competent. Conrad III, not so much. So he goes through, his idea is to just sort of go straight through Turkey. And most of it is controlled by the Seljuk Sultan. There's the Sultanate of Rum, and they're still Seljuks. So again, just to mention, completely different power base to Zengi, whose power base is based around Mosul. So they're completely different enemy, really. And a lot of the Rim of Anatolia, of Turkey, is Byzantine, but all the middle of it is still Seljuk. But Conrad wants to basically take, if he can, the exact same route that the First Crusade did. So that's what he does, but strategically, sort of tactically rather, he's no genius, and so his men, he's not really able to control his men in sort of a strict, tight military form. And so, well, quite quickly we get to, it's not that far into Turkey, is it, when you come up to Dorylaeum, and there's a big battle at Dorylaeum. And if anyone remembers our conversation from talking about the First Crusade, if anyone knows the First Crusade, it's in the exact same spot as the Battle of Dorylaeum in the First Crusade.
Well, I think one thing that's really important to mention here, and is something that those who are maybe, just sort of starting their journey into an enthusiasm for history, is that when you look at the medieval period and what's going on here with the Crusades as well, that you have to remember that the armies that the Crusaders are bringing with them to the Holy Land and to go out, as you say, into Sultanate of Rum, these are not, we're living in a world of pre-permanent national standing armies. These are not professional armies. These are, feudal levies and people, sort of conscripted by their lords from their lands. So they're not professionally drilled and trained military orders like we have today. And with that, there will come a certain level of panic and what do I do? I've not trained for this. I was farming, 5, months ago or whatever it might be. And I think that that's just a really key thing to emphasize here, because it's not always considered. We just look at this army and this army, but when you consider the actual makeup of that army and where those men holding those spears came from, you begin to understand it in a very different light.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. You might have some knights who they might be like a standalone sort of armoured tank on the battlefield, essentially, and might be sort of very well trained with the lance or with sword play, but they're still running around as an individual, essentially. So yeah, this idea that even in the ancient world, don't you, you've got like sort of a trained phalanx in the age of Philip or Alexander. Obviously, famously, some of the Roman legions at various points were extremely well drilled, but we're not dealing with anything like that. As you sort of mentioned, feudal levies, something like that. Yeah, quite often peasants. Well, it's on all sorts of levels. It's an armed pilgrimage. If you're not a knight, if you're not an actual man at arms, you're basically just an armed pilgrim. And you certainly won't be drilled into sort of, forming square when ordered to, or, anything like that. Or you won't have any sort of tactical ability to know that that's a really dangerous defile to try and go through, or anything at all. So it's complete amateur hour in a way. Now, a lot of that can be negated if your senior leadership are competent. If you've got someone like Richard III or maybe Geoffrey de Bouillon or Bohemond or someone. Sorry, what did I say?
You said the third.
Oh, sorry. No, Richard the First. Richard the First, yes. Of course, the Lionheart. If your overall commander, or at least your senior leadership, are competent, a lot of that can be negated. But if they're not, if you've got someone like Louis or Conrad III in control, who also haven't really got much military sense, then you're probably going to have a bad time. And so at Dorylaeum, where Curto's...
Have a bad time.
Yeah. If you can... Because but almost certainly it's going to be the case that a Frankish army going through Anatolia and going down into the Near East, into the Levant, whatever happens, you're almost certainly going to be massively outnumbered. That's definitely what's going to be the case. So, are you able to and equipped to deal with that reality? In the First Crusade, they nearly always were, it seemed. Conrad here now isn't. So, and the Seljuks, from their point of view, it's like, from their point of view, they're like, what we really need, if a Frankish army comes deep into our land, what we really want is for them to get all strung out and to not really be defending themselves properly. And, to not set up pickets, what in later years we would call pickets or scouts. And that's exactly what Conrad does. That's exactly what he does. Like, he'll set up a camp and won't really put out pickets or scouts and won't have any sort of formation set up to defend against cavalry charges or anything at all, and just in general have himself sort of strung out. From the Seljuk perspective, because they're sort of hit and run horse archer type guerrilla fighters on a grand scale, being very glib about all of that, an expert in this would probably roll their eyes at me saying that, but nonetheless you get the picture. They're like, well, he couldn't have made more mistakes as far as we're concerned. And so at Dorylaeum, just to cut it short a little bit, it gets really massacred, really, doesn't it? It gets cut up quite badly, quite quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a pretty resounding defeat. I mean, a lot of the German army, if I remember correctly, is lost in this one battle. It's almost... I mean, that's almost curtains, actually. You've only just crossed the Bosphorus, as you say, and you've basically been wrecked at the first hurdle. And it's that tragedy about it that it didn't have to be this way. That's always the thing that you get with it, that, as you say, there's so many textbook rules with this sort of thing about just how to organize an army. And Conrad just seems to negate them all. He just doesn't seem to, and unfortunately, it's that thing that if Conrad's not the most competent commander, unfortunately, Louis is not any better. In fact, he might even be a bit worse, if I were to be a bit provocative.
That's fair to say. Probably the biggest mistake, it's easy to look back on these things, isn't it, with 2020 hindsight. Probably one of the biggest, grandest mistakes was that he didn't wait at Constantinople, or at least just on the other side of the Bosphorus, for Louis to turn up, for the other Frankish army to turn up, and they all go together. He didn't do that. So he goes down to Dorylaeum with something in the order of 20,000 men, and 2,000 stumble back. And he himself is wounded, I believe, quite severe. He doesn't die of the wound or anything, but he's wounded, a proper wound, not just a scratch. And 18 out of 20,000 men are lost. So it's sort of a tiny remnant straggles back to the coast. They're basically cut to ribbons, really. And by this time, Louis and his Queen Eleanor and all their men have got to Constantinople. And when they cross over into Anatolia, they quite quickly come across Conrad and his remnant, his bloodied remnant. And they're sort of aghast, you can imagine. It's like, wait, what? We thought you've got more men than us even, and you're supposed to be the vanguard. Like, we're supposed to we'll meet you in Edessa, sort of thing. You'll cut the path for us. There'll be nothing left in your wake but destruction and death. Oh no, you've been turned away, as you say, almost at the first hurdle, and almost entirely defeated. So the French morale, and you can only imagine what's actually in Louis and his senior knights in their mind. It's like, oh, what have we bitten off here? What are we looking at? Oh dear,
This is a bad omen.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah, and the leader of the Seljuks is a Mesud the First. And of course, it's a great victory from their point of view, incredible victory, really. So Conrad goes back to Constantinople, I believe, because he just needs to sort of catch his breath or actually recuperate from his wound. I think he also gets an illness as well at some point. Anyway, he actually goes all the way back to Constantinople to sort of to convalesce. But Louis goes on. He does decide to actually try and skirt the coast, rather than just cut straight into the middle of Turkey. He does make the fairly prudent decision to sort of go around the coast.
Yeah. Yes, much more tactically wise. Although it's still not great, because they are constantly getting harassed by the Seljuks, because obviously the Seljuks are emboldened by what they've been able to just do to the German army as well. And I think, if I'm remembering my history correctly, this is at the moment when Louis actually hands command of the army over to Everard d'Abarat, who was the master of the Temple of Paris. So he was the authority of the Templars in Paris. And he basically reconfigures the army and divides it into units of 50. and he actually has a Templar knight in charge of each unit, and they're supposed to basically obey him unwaveringly, without question. And once Louis, who is not a military man, actually hands the command of the army over to a more military individual, things do start to go a bit better. And, they redeploy the army so that the archers are now at the rear so that they can counter the Turkish bowmen who are ambushing them and harassing them from the mountains, obviously, as they go by.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. Louis realises that he isn't really the man to be leading a military expedition like this through hostile lands, that you actually need a good eye, sort of a good military eye to be doing this, because quite rightly, as you say, Seljuks are harassing them, are harrying them, more or less at all times, really. And so this can't be half-assed. This can't be sort of an amateur attempt. You need to be doing things properly. You just need to be doing things properly. And so Louis knows that he's not the man for that. So yeah, he delegates a lot of the responsibilities. But that's easier said than done, because he's got quite a few contingents. For example, the more northern Frankish knights and their contingents are, really quite different to those from Aquitaine, for example. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her retainers don't always, or quite often, won't take any orders from anyone else, and so that's
just like Eleanor.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Just a law unto themselves, and so that again, that's sort of the last thing you need when you're going through, hostile enemy territory. When you're behind enemy lines, everyone sort of needs to be on the same page. That's sort of 101, that you're all working together, that you're all pulling in the same direction. And they're not really doing that. They're a bit, as you mentioned, they've got some sort of coherence and everything, but it's not quite good enough. I mean, so to montage through it a little bit, there's various ambushes. There's a bit of a battle at Ephesus. There's a battle of Meander. These are like Turkish, basically giant Seljuk ambushes that are repelled. But one of probably the main action is a Mount Cadmus, the Battle of Mount Cadmus, where the Seljuks catch the Franks going through this mountain range, all strung out, sort of fairly badly strung out across a couple of different peaks. And they realised that, because they're very good. Again, this is what they do, the Seljuks, is they wait for the right moment and fall upon an enemy in sort of just the right way. And that's what they do at Mount Cadmus, and they're able to, cut up a great deal of Louis' army. Some say it might have been to do with Eleanor of Aquitaine's giant baggage train that had was at least partly responsible for the army being so strung out at that moment. Or certainly it seems there's an element that her men-at-arms, the men from Aquitaine, hadn't necessarily done exactly as they were told or needed to do, and it just meant the army was even more strung out at a very particularly bad moment. And the Seljuks just, leap on the opportunity. And Louis himself escapes sort of by the skin of his teeth in that instance, doesn't he?
Yes. It's always a strange one, because obviously that's twice now where they've been thoroughly humiliated and the kings have just about escaped. And obviously it doesn't always go that way. There are times when the ambush is just too severe and even the king doesn't make it out. So again, to sort of debunk some of the sort of those novice myths, that, of course the king made it out, because you often, when you look at something like this, you often think of the kings as like the protagonists of the story in a way. Well, of course they're going to make it to the end because they're the kings, but it doesn't always go that way. So when you say, just made it out in time, it really could just be that. It could be the arrow was an inch away or whatever it be, or the lances were closing in around. It really is by the skin of the teeth at times.
I mean, in this instance, it's sort of as close as it could get. Apparently, he wasn't just chopped down on the spot, because Louis, being very pious for a king, for a 12th century king, very, very pious, didn't wear ornate sort of kingly garb and jewels or anything. He would wear the clothes of a pilgrim quite often. And so he's not obviously the king. And so he sort of in the melee, no one made a beeline for him, and the accounts are that he literally scrambled up a hillside, like clinging on to the grass and roots on a really, really steep hillside, and scrambled away for his life in the middle of an actual ambush. And so, by the skin of his teeth, really does do that one justice. He just about barely survived, and by rights probably should have been killed in that. And just about escaped. But his army isn't annihilated there at the Battle of Mount Cadmus. It is very, very badly damaged, but it isn't completely annihilated to a man. He has still got, a fair few thousand men left. And so it's around this time that some decisions have to be made, because it looks bad. It doesn't look like things aren't going the way Louis had hoped. So it's around this time that I think correct me if I'm wrong in this, I think he makes the decision he's going to take to ship and go to Antioch by ship. It's not a fantastic distance now, but he would still have to hack his way through quite a lot of hard, deserty, mountainous country of southern Anatolia still. So he leaves most of his men to carry on doing that. And sorry, go ahead.
Unfortunately, I was just going to say to flesh out the details of that a little bit. It's quite, again, it's really dire, because he actually gets to Italia on the sort of southern coast of Turkey, and which is within the Byzantine borders of it's in the Byzantine Empire. So it's ostensibly friendly territory, but it is right on the cusp of that border into Seljuk land. But the problem is that Italia is it's a port, sure, but it's actually just a really small town. And when they arrive there, they find that, very quickly, the Byzantines, once again, about that breakdown of the relationship between the Byzantines and the Franks, the Byzantines haven't sent them enough ships to ferry the entirety of the army across to Antioch. And so Louis makes a decision to wait for more ships to arrive, but storms prevent those ships from coming and taking off, and the Byzantines can't provide them with more ships. And before you know it, well, obviously, if you've got a sitting army inside your town, the food is going to run out really, really quickly. And so very, very quickly within Italia, you start to see the food disappearing, and what food does still exist is heavy inflation, and now all of a sudden food is becoming incredibly expensive, and the disease and the plague is starting to set in because of the conditions that are. And on top of that, you've got all these Turks just sitting outside the gate waiting for you to leave, because they know you can't take it much longer. And so, that's the context in which Louis decides to leave a large portion of his army. And he takes a small portion of ships that he does have with the best of his men to cross the sea to Antioch. And a lot of those men that do get left in Italia die through either plague or they chance it. They just think it's not worth it. I'm chancing it. I'm going to go out, and then get massacred by Turks. So again, it's really, really horrible, misfortune, just bad planning on behalf of the Byzantines again, or they could have done more. They know they could have done more, or Louis just hadn't thought it through enough, and it results in the death of so many crusaders.
Yeah, and that's the thing that will come up again, and certainly in the next one, if we talk about the Fourth Crusade, is that there's the impression that the Byzantine emperor hadn't done enough, hadn't really been fulfilling his end of the bargain. But certainly it's the case, 100% it's the case, that Louis and his sort of logistics, he hasn't got any logistics, but this idea of having a good solid plan and contingency plans and all that sort of thing. A logistics train, some sort of way of revictualling your men and animals. Just not really anything. It's pure amateur hour, really. And so he sails for Antioch, where he's destined to meet up with Eleanor's uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, who is sort of the regent, the monarch of Antioch, Prince of Antioch. And so there we've got a fairly famous episode, because he does do that, sort of successfully gets there. And again, on the map, when you see sort of the Principality of Antioch, it's next to what was the Crusader county of Edessa. And so, if we can remember, Eugenius III and Bernard of Clairvaux's crusade was meant to retake Edessa off of
to get back to the main topic of what this was all for. After all that death that they've experienced on the way. That's why they're here. It's like...
And now finally they're there, and Raymond's like, brilliant. I'd hoped for more men. You look like you're in a pretty bad state, but nonetheless, you're here now. Okay, so let's get this going. Let's see if we can drum up some support from Tripoli and maybe even from Jerusalem, and let's get ourselves together and let's go on an attack into Edessa. But Louis doesn't want to do that at this point now. Something's changed.
Yeah, Louis decides to not break the habit of a lifetime and just make the wrong decision again. But I think a part of it is related to, I'd read somewhere that within Louis was actually a sense that his brother had wanted to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but had died before he'd been able to. And so you can probably sense within Louis that is actually an aspect of certainly the psyche behind why he wants to do what he wants to do and go to Jerusalem. But the most frustrating thing about it is, just okay, but take Edessa, do that first, do the thing that you're actually here for, that you swore to the Pope that you do, then you can go on your pilgrimage. He completely gets the cart before the horse, and he doesn't realise he doesn't get the. I think he just understates the problem. He doesn't get it. He's not a crusader. He doesn't think like a crusader. He thinks like a pilgrim. And those are just two totally different things.
That's a very good point. I've never heard it expressed exactly like that, but I think that's absolutely spot on. He's much more got the mind of a pilgrim. Because bear this in mind, there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Now, that is ground zero. That is absolutely the most holy of holies. The county of Edessa, in a devout religious pilgrim's mind, is nothing. It's not even a sideshow. It's nothing. It's a bit of desert. Don't care about Edessa. I've never, ever, ever cared one iota for Edessa. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, however, is the centre of the universe in a way. And so, in Louis's mind, it is the case, accounts say it, and in letters he says it himself. It's like, well, if nothing else, I've not come all this way to not visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I am going to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's happening. Whatever else happens, okay? So, but it's an interesting moment in time, isn't it, when they get to Antioch, and there's some rumours that perhaps Eleanor of Aquitaine, Louis's wife, may have had an over-familiar relationship with her uncle Raymond, but quite often people say that's almost certainly just sort of rumours after the fact. We're not sure, but anyway, some contemporary accounts suggest there might be something there, but it's certainly not proven in any way, shape or form.
No, and it's one of those things that, again, you have to look at it in the context of the time. And I know that nowadays you just think, oh, well, having an affair, is easy. But when you look at her station in society as well, she doesn't really walk anywhere alone.
she's constantly surrounded by handmaidens. She constantly has waiters on her. It's not easy to just slip away and do something like that, even if you wanted to, So I think that's something that's worth mentioning as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. People say that about all sorts of things, that Queen Elizabeth I had all sorts of affairs. It's like, well, logistically, that's really quite difficult. Like physically, logistically, being constantly in the presence of your ladies in waiting, it's not... It's very difficult, but so just to cut ahead on that, it's an interesting moment in time. What exactly was going on in Louis's mind? Why he decides to effectively abandon trying to retake Edessa? There may well have been, and lots of people have said that there's sort of the military, political reality of it. That once he finds himself at Antioch, he calculates it's simply not possible to take on. I was going to say Zengi, but Zengi's dead by this point. But to take on the forces that have, it's Nur ad-Din, isn't it? To take on Nur ad-Din and retake Edessa is just not physically going to be possible to do that. It's not that he just changed his mind; it's that he had no option. But who knows? That's something that that historians can and do argue about, that exact point. I suspect, just personal opinion alert, I suspect it was a bit of both, but mainly it was the military reality of it, because he had sort of sworn to do that. I don't think he abandoned it lightly. But anyway, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think that's certainly true, possibly in that moment at Antioch. But when you look at, certainly after the Council of Acre, which I'm sure we're going to get onto soon, but where they discuss what they're going to do. But by the time that council is over, those Englishmen and French from Portugal have arrived. Conrad has come back with a little bit more of his army, and the numbers aren't what they could be, but they are starting to swell. So it's not. I agree with your assessment, but a little bit later on, he does have the numbers to maybe pivot on his opinion and realign and rethink, and he still chooses not to. So I think that probably leans more towards the idea that he just didn't want to do it, ultimately.
Yeah, maybe. And Edessa always had been, from day one, had been a difficult bit of land to take and hold, certainly to hold.
Yes.
It's a difficult ask, right? And so up in Antioch, there does at some point, because Louis and Eleanor of Aquitaine's relationship had been soured for years, really, already by this point. They'd been together for 15 odd years or something. And apparently Raymond and some other people say, look, why don't you just stay here? It's too dangerous. There's no point you going on with Louis. And, what we do know, all that is a bit hearsay, but what isn't hearsay is he essentially puts her under a type of close arrest where she threatens, it seems.
First time she'll have
Right, yeah, she needs to get used to being under arrest. Certainly, she makes some sort of noises that she might not willingly carry on with Louis wherever he might go. So he puts her under a close arrest and sort of forces her and her entourage to go wherever he's going to go. And Raymond, obviously, isn't really happy with this. He thought that these armies were going to come and help him sort of, at least shore up his position in Antioch, if not sort of fight and win Edessa for him, on behalf of him on some level. He'd hoped all those sorts of things. But none of it materialises, and Louis goes off on ship again, I believe, isn't it? Down to Jerusalem. In order to visit the Holy Sepulchre, which is exactly what he does.
Yeah, it seems to be the one thing on his bucket list, whilst he's there, so he's not exactly not going to do it, is he? I think, one thing that's maybe interesting to mention, it's a bit of a backtrack, but just as a bit of trivia to those who don't know, we mentioned in passing that Zengi had actually died by this point, but what's interesting about the nature of his death is that he was actually murdered by a Frankish slave, allegedly. when he was drunk one night, and apparently this was one of his favourite slaves, and but his slave knifed him to death in his sleep. So I suppose you reap what you sow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I heard it was sort of in a bath, but quite a lot of these accounts aren't always uniform. But that's the thing, if you're going to be a tyrant, and I don't mean it in the ancient Greek sense of just an autocrat, but a true sort of tyrant, that you terrify everyone around you. If that spills out to the people that are quite literally surround you, your inner entourage, you're in a group of people that physically surround you on a day-to-day basis, when they start fearing for their lives in a very, very real, direct, immediate sense, that you might just order their death for essentially nothing at any moment, your numbers are your days are numbered at that point. There are some exceptions. Someone like Stalin wasn't the case. Someone like Genghis Khan, it wasn't the case. But for other great Khans, other great Mongol Khans, the exact same fate befell them. Even a lowly slave, or some Roman emperors, Commodus springs to mind. One of your favourite wrestlers who's in your inner entourage. He just fears you might have him killed at any given moment. So he strangles you to death when you're not looking.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened, of course, to Maximilien Robespierre.
Right.
With his other Jacobins, he left them in terror and fear of their own lives, and so they got to him first in the end. This is, all throughout history, as you say, is, okay, it didn't quite happen to Stalin, but, it happened to a lot of powerful people who had that form of, as you say, tyranny and despotism.
Yeah, like gangsters, really. If you're a tyrant, you're a type of gangster. You're engaged in gangsterism, and that's the fate of a lot of gangsters. That the people closest to you fear that you'll turn on them, so they kill you. It's simple, really, isn't it? It's quite a simple thing. But that's what happens to Zengi, and so he has two sons. Nuruddin is the main one, and they fight amongst themselves for the spoils, at least to begin with. But Nuruddin sort of is the main one, really. We'll mention him mainly. And so Louis goes down to Jerusalem, gets to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If I were ever in Israel, I would certainly visit there. And as you mentioned, his numbers are actually bolstered because he's kind of got a remnant of his army left. But at Jerusalem, there's the already the Crusader state of Jerusalem. They've got their own small army. He's got his own remnant. More men are turning up. There's a remnant of Conrad himself, and the remnant of his army turn up. There's the Templars, the Hospitallers. There's other contingents from Europe turn up. Some of the English from and other Franks that had been involved in Lisbon and Portugal and Spain, they turn up. So anyway, their numbers at Jerusalem are now sort of being swelled to the point of being a half-decent army again. I think they've got something in the order of 13,000 men at one point, which is on the order... Well, when the First Crusaders took Jerusalem itself in 1099, I think they only had about that many. So it's not a giant army, but it's something. It's certainly big enough to get something done. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, if you play your cards right, there's something that can be done there. You actually have, a way to move forward. And I suppose that's where, is this where we get to the Council of Acre?
Yeah.
Where they all, so they all start having a grand meeting. Conrad's there, of course. Louis is there. The new king of Jerusalem, Baldwin III, is there. And the Queen Mother, I suppose, Queen Melisende at this point. Raymond is, of course, there. And a lot of the elites and the nobility of Outremer. And they're all there to decide what to do. And, okay, well, it's not as many men as we wanted, but we have, as you say, we have something. What are we going to do with it? And it seems like they come up with 3 possible targets. And they're all sort of debating which one to go with. Some say Aleppo, because it's one of Nur ad-Din's headquarters. Some say Cairo, because obviously it's a breadbasket, and it's a place that the Muslims can pull vast swathes of resources from in order to, because that's the thing as well, the Muslim world from the Christian point of view, it just doesn't relent. There's just waves and waves of men and resources that they can throw at Outremer. Not to I suppose in a contemporary sort of pop culture sense, it could feel a bit like the orcs, just surrounding Minas Tirith. It's just vast armies just constantly rolling up to you, and you've only got what you've got, and there's not a lot you can do about it. So you've got to play it smart. And then obviously the third option is Damascus, which they considered because I think I'm right in thinking that Damascus had actually been an enemy of Zengi, but the Atabag of Damascus had actually married off his daughter to Nur ad-Din, so they had actually made an alliance now. And so even though, as you were saying, to bring it right back to the beginning of our conversation, with all of these Muslim factions sort of being divided, you can see now that they're starting to thread those threads, that is to say, together to actually start making alliances against the Franks. And so Damascus is another option.
Yeah, so absolutely. So at that point, when they're at Acre, which is just on the coast there, they have the Council of Palmyra, or often just called the Council of Acre. They've got some decisions to make. It seems that it's not really on the table that they're going to sort of all go back up to Antioch and invade Edessa. That doesn't really seem to be on the table. But as you say, there's a few different options. Now later, we won't go on to this, but after this whole crusade's over, for the next couple of decades, there's fighting in Egypt and across North Africa. So that doesn't go away. That is sort of in the mind, at least of the leaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But they decide they're going to take Damascus. Now on a map you can see it's probably the most obvious thing to do in a way. It's not a million miles from Jerusalem, but it's sort of not. Again, historians have looked back on it with 2020 vision and sort of said that's not really a great idea though, for a few different reasons. For a start, Damascus had been sort of its own thing. The rulers of Damascus, although Muslim, hadn't been formally allied with what's his with the Zangids, with the sons of Zengi. There's Nur ad-Din and his brother Saif ad-Din, and where they'd been fighting each other, the smartest play the Crusaders could have done is to shore up their alliance with Damascus, because they had been allied with the rulers of Damascus. Probably the best idea was to shore up their relationship with Damascus as maybe some sort of buffer state against the Zengids, rather than trying to take them out at the first opportunities, backstabbing them in a way. But others have said, as you said just then, that actually already the Damascenes had already created. They'd already stabbed the Crusaders in the back diplomatically, politically. That they'd already made some sort of alliance with the Zengids, and that the people of Damascus, the rulers of Damascus rather, can't have their cake and eat it. They've got to be on one side or the other, largely. And so you can make the argument that the Crusaders at the Council of Acre did make the right choice. It was sort of maybe their only choice. But I think the consensus is that it was a bad play. If nothing else, don't antagonise them. Maybe go for Aleppo. Maybe just shore up your position as is. But it seems that at least in Louis's mind, he felt he'd come all this way to try and sort of relieve Edessa or reconquer Edessa. He's come all this way and he's failed to do that now. So he at least needs to win some sort of military glory somewhere along the line. And it seems that in the minds of the rulers of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that their sort of fairly short-sighted view was that if we can just take Damascus, it at least denies it to Nur ad-Din, if nothing else. It denies him it. So that's what we really want. And Louis, not being sort of a very, very forceful person, sort of fell in with that, just went along with that idea. Yes. Well, and so anyway, the upshot is that's what they do. They march on Damascus and try to besiege it.
Yes, and I think as well, it's, at least Damascus is, I mean, at that point, Edessa's not really worth retaking. It's more or less being burnt to the ground. It's not... The amount of resources just to rebuild it at that point would have been enormous. And also there's the fact that Damascus is an already wealthy and prosperous city, and that unlike Edessa, Damascus at least has some sort of biblical material to it. It actually is in the Bible, whereas Edessa, I mean, I'm not a scholar on religious texts, but at least Damascus has some sort of religious element to it, unlike Edessa.
Yeah, no, Damascus is absolutely a prize, a jewel of a city.
Yes,
absolutely, no doubt about that. It's one of the most important cities in the region. Even then, I mean, it is today, but even then, I mean, in World War One, Damascus is sort of the pivot upon which the whole war in the East turns, almost.
Well, there's a massive race to get there, isn't there? And Lawrence is determined to get there first, yes.
Right. Both Jerusalem and Damascus have, not always, but have nearly always been just amazing prizes. And so it makes sense. There is certainly a logic to it, that if we can take it and then defend it, then that is worth doing. But with a big city like that, a big walled city, it's no small ask to besiege it and take it. That's why when the First Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099, why that was so remarkable that they were able to do it with so few men and so quickly. And so here, they march on Damascus. They approach it from the west because there's a lot of orchards, or back then, I don't know if there still are actually, but back then, the whole west of the city, there were lots and lots of rolling orchards. And the Crusaders thought that we'll attack through that, and if we're held up there for months and things, which may well be likely, we'll just have a ready source of food in these orchards, which will be good for us. So let's do that.
Fresh water as well.
Yep.
Outside, right. And for the orchards, because obviously you're not going to have orchards growing without the water. So the two, it's in any estimation of all the sides that they could have set up camp on, it made the most strategic sense, of course, to set it up amongst the orchards. And as you say, sieges can last for months. As we were saying previously, the Siege of Lisbon went on for 4 months. This is, you really need to be in the place where you're going to be able to get those resources.
Yeah, sieges could quite often go on for months. At a minimum, they can often go on for years and years and years.
Just ask Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, yeah. What, did he besiege Tyre for 20 years or something?
Yeah.
Unsuccessfully?
Yes.
So there's some siege. There was a siege in the 17th century in Germany that I think went on for 30 years or something crazy. A siege. If a siege goes on for months and months or a couple of years, that's not unusual whatsoever. But they realised, the Crusaders realised, like in 1099, they needed it to fall quick. They couldn't really be doing a couple of years worth of siege. They couldn't. That wasn't going to work for them. So their plan was to take it quickly, sort of by surprise, although not true surprise, but sort of by surprise, by a coup de main, and try and attack the walls quickly, get over, Well, it doesn't really go their way. For a start, one of the first things is that these orchards actually proved to be a poison chalice maybe, but they proved to be very good ground for ambushes and guerrilla attacks and counter attacks against them, because there's lots and lots of places to hide and set ambushes, and it just became a bit of a killing field. What they would probably be better off with is a big open plain, and you can see anyone trying to sneak up on you or trying to attack you. That's probably it is better in their context. And so this whole orchard thing didn't really work out the way they wanted it to.
Yeah, no, entirely. And so obviously realizing this very, very quickly. I mean, I think they're only in that orchard for about 2 days before it's suggested that they move over to the eastern wall, where obviously it has all those things you're describing, where I think they're told, obviously the information was wrong, but I believe that they're told that it's actually a higher wall. They are told it's a higher wall, but obviously that they will be able to move their engines around there. And again, there's just this feeling of haste and urgency and rushing it. You know, they're trying to rush it. And so they move over to the eastern wall.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's it. It's a rush job. Absolutely. And out there on sort of the eastern plain, yeah, it's more open, but you've got pros and cons with that. Yeah, people can't necessarily ambush you as easily, but you've got far less resources and less access to water and all sorts of things.
Die of thirst, and you know,
right.
I mean, you will in that heat, you know, in the baking sun, in some metal armor.
And now the city itself is between you and any route of escape back towards Jerusalem as well, which doesn't help.
Yes.
And the biggest thing, it seems, the biggest element to the failure of the Siege of Damascus, if you hadn't already guessed, is that the forces of Nur ad-Din and Saif ad-Din, that they sort of put aside their differences briefly in order to relieve Damascus. And they're on the way, and the Crusaders get word that they're on their way, and they've probably got, we don't know, but they may have had 30, 40, 50,000 men are coming to sort of help in the relief of Damascus. And so the whole thing only lasts, 4 days? Because on like the 4th or the 5th day, people in the Crusader camp, various contingents, sort of lose their nerve, start losing their bottle a bit, and just retreating. Different factions just decide they're not going to wait around for Nur ad-Din, the combined forces of the Zengids, to arrive. They're not going to wait for it. You know, we needed to take Damascus pretty much straight away, within a day or two, and we failed. We failed to do that. So it's over.
It's really anticlimactic.
Yeah.
It's not even it's not even oh, they were so close. It just feels really.
Yeah.
They just, to quote a line that me and my dad love from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, it's, had your chance, muffed it. It's gone.
Yeah, you had your chance and you blew it. Like De Niro in Copland, you blew it. Yeah, they had their chance, and that's it. So they have to retreat, and it's an absolutely ignominious disaster, really. Louis never gets over it. When Bernard of Clairvaux hears of it, he's sort of humiliated for the rest of his life on the strength of it. It sours the relationship with Byzantium forever. They quite immediately fall into an all-out sort of blame game, don't they, the Crusaders?
Yeah, then the blaming starts. And, I think it was the Germans, and Conrad starts blaming the Templars, and Louis starts blaming the Byzantines, and obviously Bernard and the Pope just start blaming the sins of Europe. Because that's the question that when you're living in that time period, isn't it? You ask yourself, well, the obvious question: why? Why would God, encourage you to travel to the other side of the world only to fail?
Yeah, God wasn't on your side. God didn't want you to succeed, and that's why you didn't. Yeah. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
It really is as simple as that.
Those Muslims to succeed.
Yeah. And Manuel I of Byzantium, he is sort of quite profoundly blamed because they can only sort of blame each other to a degree. Because they can't sort of blame each other to the point of starting a civil war with each other, or they don't. I mean, they could, but they don't. But it's quite easy. They can all agree that certainly the Byzantine emperor hadn't done his part, and in fact, isn't it possible that this is what he wanted all along? And in fact, maybe his spies were in league with the Seljuks and the Zengids all along, and all that sort of thing. Yeah, just really, really deep recriminations and bitterness towards the Byzantines.
And after all, doesn't Manuel hate the Franks? Doesn't he hate that scummy King Roger II of Sicily, who was Norman, who was actually, basically at war with? There's all sorts of geopolitical factors that start to come out of this, and you can see that it's amazing that feeling of the Crusades can unite them. But at the end of the day, when people, when they went on crusade, they didn't just become holy, godlike, angelic servants. They're still corruptible by all of the temptations of what it means to be a human being, of course, and no amount of crusading is ever going to really make up for that fact that they were just humans at the end of the day.
True. And it's a failure on another level, isn't it? If part of it was to retake Edessa, that failed. Part of it was to sort of relive the glories of the First Crusade, to sort of walk in the footsteps of people like Geoffrey de Bouillon and Tancred. And you failed in that as well. You've absolutely failed to do any of that. You got to Damascus and within 4 days had to run away. I mean, because that is it. Louis goes back to Jerusalem and then embarks back, pays for some Genoese ships to take him back to France.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the end. And he goes down in history, really, as militarily a failure. Famously, Eleanor called him more of a monk than a king. Well, he's certainly not a military-style king, a Richard I style king. It's just no way, shape or form.
Yeah, certainly not. For all of the turmoil between them, she was so much more suited to Henry II. Especially as you say, when you watch The Lion in Winter, in a way they can't stand each other, but in another way they were just made for each other.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Okay, well, that's essentially in a nutshell the story of the Second Crusade. I hope we've done some justice. Have you got any other sort of big points or main points you'd like to make about it at all?
I would only say that after the Second Crusade, that's sort of almost the end of the Pilgrim era. From then on, going into the Third and onwards, that they become almost just exclusively military expeditions. Sort of gone are the days of the Peter the Hermits and those sorts of days, and the pilgrims going down there. It becomes much more military from then on. I think that's an important point to mention, sort of at that turn going into the third.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's a great point to make. That by the time, because again, it's another 40 years later, 50 years later, when Richard goes down there, and by that point, it's like, no, we're going to get a bit more serious. We're going to get very, very serious about organisation and logistics, and make bases in order to feed ourselves properly. For a start. And there'll be sort of military discipline, and we won't have massive contingents of women, and the fighting men we do take will be sort of at least semi-professional soldiers, and all that sort of thing, and we'll have an actual military level of command, a command structure in place, and people follow orders sort of to the T, and all that sort of thing. We're going to get a lot more serious about the organisational side of things. Yeah, they learned that lesson, certainly.
It doesn't diminish the resolve of the West to go on crusade, but it does definitely, as you say, it sharpens their mind.
Yeah.
It makes them realise that perhaps, at the very least, they can't just rely on the grace of God alone, for victory. They're actually going to have to put in the legwork themselves.
Right, yeah. Okay, well, thank you for your time, Luca. I'll draw it to a close there, but I really enjoyed this discussion, and I'll definitely have you back on to talk about the Fourth Crusade, which is a whole different kettle of fish, isn't it? That one.
Say that the first and the second feel like repeats of one another. This doesn't repeat anything. This is its own thing.
Okay, well, until next time, take care.
Thank you.